shaves. It was supposed to be a routine hearing in the Jefferson County Courthouse. Officers, attorneys, and defendants filled the courtroom, waiting for the judge to arrive. Officer Daniel Crowley, a seasoned cop with a history of aggressive policing, stood near the bench, arms crossed, eyeing the room with a cold glare. Then, a black woman walked in. She wore a simple blouse and slacks, her natural hair styled in tight coils. Crowley's eyes narrowed as he watched her approach the bench. He didn't recognize her. Before she could even introduce herself, Crowley grabbed her by the arm. "You don't belong up here," he barked. "Where do you think you're going?" The woman looked at him, her expression calm but firm. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she said. Crowley scoffed. He had dealt with what he called troublemakers before. Without a second thought, he reached for a pair of clippers, confiscated from a previous case, and in a move that stunned the courtroom, roughly shaved off a large section of her hair. Gasps filled the room. A lawyer dropped his pen. A bailiff took a step forward, but hesitated, unsure of what to do. The woman stood still for a moment, then slowly ran a hand over her newly exposed scalp. She took a deep breath, straightened her posture, and walked to the judge's seat. Then she spoke. "Officer Crowley," she said, her voice echoing through the silent courtroom, "you have just assaulted a sitting judge." Crowley's face drained of color. His grip on the clippers loosened, and they clattered to the floor. Judge Ayanna Mitchell turned to the bailiff. "Take this officer into custody," she said. The courtroom erupted. Cameras flashed. The same officer who had just humiliated her was now being placed in handcuffs. The irony was almost poetic. As Crowley was led away, stammering about a misunderstanding, Judge Mitchell smoothed what remained of her hair and took her seat. She glanced around the courtroom, then spoke again. "Now," she said, her tone unwavering, "let's begin." "Would you like a—" As Officer Crowley was dragged out of the courtroom, his protests grew louder. "This is a mistake. I didn't know. She didn't say." Judge Ayanna Mitchell, still seated behind the bench, tapped her gavel lightly. Silence in my courtroom. The murmurs died down. All eyes remained on her, some filled with horror, others with admiration. The sheer audacity of what had just happened left the room stunned. She turned her gaze toward the prosecutor. "Mr. Daniels, add assault and misconduct charges to Officer Crowley's file." Daniels, a young attorney who had spent years watching Crowley abuse his power, nodded. "With pleasure, Your Honor." Crowley's face twisted with fear. "You can't do this to me. I was just doing my job." Judge Mitchell leaned forward. "Your job? Your job is to uphold the law, not to assume guilt based on skin color, not to violate a person's dignity, and certainly not to humiliate a sitting judge in her own courtroom." A collective exhale rippled through the spectators. Some of them had experienced Crowley's racism firsthand. Many had feared speaking up, knowing that officers like him rarely faced consequences. Today, that changed. "Officer Crowley," Judge Mitchell continued, her voice steady, "I should recuse myself from this case due to personal involvement. But before I do, let me leave you with a thought." She stood up, revealing the uneven, half-shaved remnants of her hair. This will grow back. But the stain of what you did today, that will follow you for the rest of your life." The bailiff led Crowley away, his shoulders slumped. Cameras flashed as reporters rushed outside to break the news. Judge Mitchell took a deep breath, smoothing her robes. "Now," she said, looking out at the courtroom, "who's next on the docket?" The wheels of justice had turned that day. Not just for her, but for every person Crowley had ever wronged. And as the courtroom returned to order, one thing became clear. The days of unchecked power were over. News of Officer Crowley's courtroom assault spread like wildfire. By evening, every major network was running the story. Disgraced officer arrested after assaulting black judge in court. Racist cop's career ends in humiliation at the hands of his own victim. Judge Ayanna Mitchell stands tall after shocking courtroom incident. The video footage, captured by court cameras and a few quick-thinking journalists, became a symbol of long overdue justice. Social media erupted. Some called for sweeping police reforms. Others pointed to Crowley as proof of the racism embedded in law enforcement. And many praised Judge Mitchell for her unshaken composure in the face of blatant humiliation. Meanwhile, inside a jail cell, Crowley sat alone. His badge had been stripped, his gun confiscated, his once feared authority reduced to nothing. He couldn't escape the whispers of fellow inmates, many of whom recognized him as the same officer who had once harassed them on the streets. "This is what justice looks like," one of them muttered as he passed Crowley's cell. Back at the courthouse, Judge Mitchell was still at work. The next morning, she walked into her courtroom with a freshly shaven head, choosing to embrace her new look rather than let the incident define her. When she took her seat behind the bench, a wave of applause broke out. The bailiffs, the lawyers, even some of the defendants clapped in silent support. She smiled, then raised a hand. "I appreciate the support," she said, "but we have work to do." From that day forward, Judge Mitchell became a national figure. She fought harder against systemic racism, advocating for stricter laws against police misconduct. She spoke at universities, trained young lawyers, and pushed for the reform the system desperately needed. And though her hair grew back, her legacy was already set in stone. Justice had spoken, and this time it refused to be silenced. Would you like an alternate ending? More details. In the weeks following the incident, Judge Ayanna Mitchell's name became a rallying cry for justice reform. Across the country, activists, legal scholars, and everyday citizens praised her composure, resilience, and the way she turned a moment of humiliation into a movement for change. Officer Crowley, meanwhile, faced swift consequences. The footage of him forcibly shaving the judge's head had led to immediate termination from the police force. But his punishment didn't stop there. Prosecutors charged him with assault, abuse of power, and civil rights violations. His trial, ironically, took place in the very courthouse where he once wielded unchecked authority. This time, though, he sat in the defendant's chair. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours before reaching a verdict: guilty. Sentenced to 5 years in prison, Crowley was stripped of his badge, his influence, and the illusion of impunity. A new beginning. Judge Mitchell continued her work. She launched a judicial initiative to hold law enforcement accountable, ensuring officers with histories of misconduct were barred from service. She met with lawmakers to push for stronger protections against police abuse. And in a defining moment, she stood before Congress and testified about racial bias in the legal system. Her bald head, now a symbol of resilience, became iconic. The day after Crowley's sentencing, Judge Mitchell returned to her courtroom as usual. But something had changed. Outside the courthouse, hundreds of people had gathered. Some held signs that read "Justice for All" and "Accountability starts here." Others simply stood in quiet support. As she walked inside, a young black girl ran up to her. She hesitated for a moment, then asked, "Can I be a judge like you someday?" Judge Mitchell knelt down and smiled. "You can be anything you want," she said. "And when you get there, make sure you never let anyone tell you otherwise." The girl grinned and ran back to her mother, who nodded in silent thanks. Judge Mitchell straightened her robe, stepped into the courtroom, and took her seat. She tapped her gavel once. "Court is now in session." The fight for justice continued, and she was ready for it. Behind bars, Officer Daniel Crowley sat on the stiff cot of his prison cell, staring at the gray concrete walls. His uniform had been replaced with an orange jumpsuit, his badge with a prisoner number. The silence was deafening, but he could hear whispers from the other inmates. Some of them had been arrested by him. Some had suffered under his abuse. Now, the tables had turned. The first few weeks were the hardest. Guards who had once worked alongside him showed no sympathy. Inmates who had been victims of his aggressive policing took pleasure in watching him struggle. His arrogance faded quickly. He had spent years believing he was untouchable. Now, he was just another convict. One day, during mealtime, an inmate sat across from him. A man Crowley had arrested years ago. "You remember me?" the man asked, chewing his food slowly. Crowley swallowed hard. He did remember. He had humiliated this man, beaten him, and laughed about it. Now they sat at the same table, wearing the same prison-issued clothes. The man smirked. "Karma's funny, ain't it?" Crowley didn't respond. He had nothing to say. Judge Mitchell's rise. Meanwhile, Judge Ayanna Mitchell's influence continued to grow. She was no longer just a judge. She was a national figure. Interviews, panel discussions, and legal reforms followed. When a seat opened on the state's Supreme Court, her name was at the top of the list. The governor called her personally. "Your courage and leadership are exactly what we need," he said. "How would you feel about taking this fight to a higher level?" She accepted. Her confirmation was historic. The courtroom where she once presided was packed with supporters as she took her oath. Reporters snapped photos, capturing the moment she became Castbury Justice Ayanna Mitchell, the first black woman to serve on the state's highest court. The same courthouse where she was humiliated had now witnessed her triumph. Final encounter. Months later, as part of a judicial review, Justice Mitchell visited a state prison. As she walked through the halls, she caught a glimpse of a familiar face, Daniel Crowley. He was thinner now, his once cocky demeanor replaced by quiet resignation. He looked up and locked eyes with her. For a brief moment, the past and present collided. He expected anger. He expected a smug look. But instead, she simply nodded at him, acknowledging the man he had become, not the one he used to be. Then she turned away and continued walking, because justice had already been served. The end. Would you like an alternate? Months passed, but for Daniel Crowley, time felt frozen. Every day in prison was a reminder of the power he had once abused, and how quickly it had been stripped away. The whispers and stares never stopped. He was no longer feared. He was pitied at best, despised at worst. One evening, as he sat alone in the yard, a familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "You never thought you'd end up here, did you?" Crowley turned and saw Malcolm Reeves, a man he had arrested years ago on trumped-up charges. Reeves had spent 5 years behind bars because of Crowley's lies. Now he had only months left on his sentence. Crowley didn't answer. Reeves sat beside him on the worn-down bench. "I used to dream about this," he admitted. "About seeing you locked up. About you knowing what it's like." He studied Crowley's face. "But now? It don't feel how I thought it would." Crowley finally spoke. "Why's that?" Reeves shrugged. "Because justice isn't about revenge." He leaned forward. "Justice is about change." Crowley scoffed. "You think I can change?" Reeves stood up. "That's not for me to decide." He turned to walk away but paused. "I guess it depends on whether you ever admit to yourself what you really are." Crowley sat in silence long after Reeves left. For the first time, he wasn't angry at the system. He wasn't angry at Judge Mitchell or the media or even the inmates who watched him suffer. For the first time, he was angry at himself. Justice Mitchell's new mission. Meanwhile, Justice Ayanna Mitchell had begun a bold new initiative, a judicial reform program focused on exposing and removing corrupt officers before they could abuse their power. "We cannot wait until harm is done to act," she declared in a speech before the state legislature. "We must stop injustice before it starts." Her words resonated across the nation. Other states began adopting similar programs. Officers with histories of misconduct were investigated, disciplined, or removed before they could do irreversible harm. One evening, as she left her office, her assistant handed her a letter. "This came for you, Justice Mitchell. No return address." Curious, she opened it. The handwriting was shaky, but the message was clear. "I was wrong. I see that now. Maybe there's no redemption for me, but I needed to say it anyway. Thank you for showing me what justice really is." There was no signature. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer. Justice was not about revenge. It was about change. And today, she had proof that change was possible. The end. Would you like